Hello, my name is Lauren Shink, and this is my Ling Sci 201 final project. For my project, I decided to look at extinct and endangered languages. There has been a recent push in the linguistic community for revitalization of languages that are proclaimed dead for several different reasons. The questions about endangered and extinct languages I'm going to focus on are what parts of a language disappear first and which are the hardest to revive. The revitalization of many languages has not been successful, so I want to look at what makes this process so difficult. The aspects of language I am most interested in looking at are phonology, semantics, syntax, and vocab. I also want to look at the question of why should we care about language revitalization and try to save these dead languages. It would be much easier for all of us to communicate if we all spoke the dominant language, but my research has shown that that is not exactly the case. So my research addresses these questions by looking at the Hebrew revival effort, which is one of the most successful language revitalization movements to this date. By examining this movement, we can see what aspects of a language disappear first and which parts were the easiest to revive. We can also look at the community who speaks Hebrew to see how losing their language affected their culture, knowledge of the world, and personal attributes. My research also gives different ideas on revitalization programs that have been successful and that are worth trying. So first, I think it's really important to know what exactly identifies a language as extinct or endangered. In their article, Endangered Languages, Chris Rogers and Lyle Campbell say that a language itself isn't endangered or extinct, but rather the continued use of the language is under threat or has been defeated. Some of the main criteria for determining whether a language is extinct or endangered are the number of native speakers. So as the number of native speakers decreases, the likelihood of extinction increases. The lack of intergenerational transmission. So this is the lack of communication between older adults of the native language with children. A decrease in the number of speakers over time, which is pretty self-explanatory. And a decrease in the domains of use. So this is how much and where the language is being used. Here is some background information on the language extinction of the Hebrew language. So it was spoken since approximately the 14th century BC. Gilad Zuckerman, who worked a lot on the Hebrew revival, says that between 132 and 135 AD marked the symbolic end of the period of spoken Hebrew. And then for that 1,750 years, Hebrew was proclaimed clinically dead. Revival efforts have been in the works for 120 years, and this is an extremely long process to reach the success that it has. And I use the word success lightly because there are still aspects of the language that were not completely successful in revitalizing, and this is what I will talk about next. So now I'm going to look at what aspects of a language disappear first and which are the hardest to revive. And from the Hebrew revival effort, we have seen that there is actually a direct relationship between the two. Like I said earlier, the word success is a lightly used term because the Hebrew revival was partially a success and partially a failure. Zuckerman came up with the list, and this is the one that I've shown here, and estimated on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being a complete success and 1 being a complete failure. The different aspects of the Hebrew language with respect to the whole continuum. With 1 being a complete failure, Zuckerman ranks discourse, which is the communicative tools and speech acts, as the least successful. 2, sounds, the phonetics and phonology. 3, semantics, meaning, associations, connotations, and semantic networking. 4, constituent word order, syntax. 5, general vocabulary. 7, word formation. 9, verbal conjugations, and 10, basic vocabulary. Zuckerman found that words and conjugations are easier to revitalize than intonation, discourse, associations, and connotations. That is because the sounds of a language, semantics, and syntax are the first to disappear, which then makes them the hardest to revitalize. As a group of people becomes assimilated to the dominant language, they are more likely to give up the phonetic and phonological context of their native language. For example, in Hebrew, they do not have the voice stops or voiced fricatives. So if English were to influence them, they would learn to vibrate their vocal folds and produce the voice sounds. They would become accustomed to this, and when they try to speak Hebrew again, they could possibly have the influence of those voice stops and voice fricatives on their voiceless stops and fricatives. Oftentimes in revitalization, there is a focus on the forms of a language. Forms of language deal with the internal grammatical structure of words in order to communicate with one another. In order to communicate with someone who speaks the mainstream language, a native speaker of the endangered language will reject the grammatical structure in order to be able to communicate. This internal grammatical structure forms relationships between different words of a language. In language revitalization, they often say that semantics is quick to disappear as well. And oftentimes linguists use intonation or pitch as an example. Intonation is very quick to disappear because there are certain languages that are tonal languages, or languages that use tone in order to distinguish words from one another. There are not as many tonal languages as there are non-tonal languages. For example, English is not a tonal language, so if there were to be an endangered language that was tonal and English began influencing it, then they would learn that there are different associations of words and pitch does not come into effect. And then syntax is somewhat quick to disappear and easy to revive. There have been recent discoveries of languages with OVS, object, verb, subject, and OSV, object, subject, verb, basic word order, that are not as common and risk abandonment because of the dominant languages like English, which teach that the word order should be SVO, subject, verb, object. So you have Lauren kicked the ball. So I have my subject, Lauren, verb, kicked, and then object, the ball. A native speaker of an endangered language would attempt to reverse their pattern in order to communicate, so they would be rejecting part of their language. I collected additional data for the current revitalization efforts for the Aboriginal languages of Australia. Of an original number of over 250 known Australian Indigenous languages, only 6% or 15 are in healthy condition, and this is according to the Stop Revive Survive article. The revival efforts haven't been as successful in comparison to the Hebrew revival because there were several advantages in the Hebrew revival that helped them, and these are advantages that the Aboriginal Australian languages do not have. Such advantages are documentation, accessibility, prestige, easy borrowing, and pure numbers. Knowing that the Australian Indigenous languages are at a disadvantage, and learning from the Hebrew revival that phonetics and phonology are the first to disappear and hardest to revive, linguists should take the time to tailor a program that first focuses on the sounds of a language. And by the sounds of the language, I mean how the sounds are produced and how the sounds are put together. So since this is the hardest part to revive, they should start there in order to help revive these Indigenous languages that not very many people speak. The next question I'm looking at is, why should we care about language revitalization? And in my background research, I found that at the rate things are going, the coming century will see either the death or the doom of 90% of mankind's languages, and that was in the Endangered Languages article, and that one language dies every month. And this isn't something that only linguists should worry about, it's something that the entire population should worry about. My background research shows that there are two main reasons to care about language revitalization. The first is that losing a language affects an individual's social identity and community sense of history. If you think about it, the way people have come to know the world around them and themselves is through stories, and if a language goes extinct, all those stories go extinct along with it. And then the second reason is that we have yet to determine the full range of what is actually possible in the human language. We have these universal principles that we believe to be true, but we are constantly finding examples in different languages that challenge these principles daily. The first reason to care about language revitalization is for the concern for the community. Language loss is typically experienced as a crisis of social identity, and some scholars and community activists insist that language shifts lead to damaged communities and dysfunctional behaviors. If members of a community are not able to communicate with one another, that can cause turmoil. And if one member of a community wants to adopt the dominant language but other members don't, that can cause a split in the community. Languages are also treasure houses for information, and many different languages have stories relating to their culture and the information of the world. So these are stories that get passed on from generation to generation. So like in the beginning when we talked about the intergenerational transmission, if we don't have those older family members passing it down to the kids, no one's going to know. And if a language dies without adequate documentation, it takes with it irreplaceable knowledge, and that's a big problem with a lot of the endangered languages right now, is that there's no documentation for them. So we don't know everything about the human language, and like I said before, we're always finding things that violate the universal principles we believe to be true. We don't know for sure what the human is fully capable of because we still don't really understand the speech and language mechanisms. We have these universal principles that are set, but if we find something in a language that disproves that, then it just goes to show that we're not as close to fully understanding human language as we think we are. An example of this is in the Niviclé sound system, which is a language of Argentina and Paraguay, and it has a voiceless L but no plain L. This violates several generalizations about laterals and liquids in the human language. We have the liquids ul and and both are voiced, but in the Niviclé sound system, they are able to devoice the L and produce it without the adduction of the vocal folds. So we have this belief that the liquids are all voiced, but Niviclé, they don't have to voice it. So this goes to show that if we don't preserve languages, we might make errors in judgment of what is possible and what isn't possible in the realm of languages. We can draw two conclusions from my background information and analysis of the topics. The first is that the phonetics and phonology, or the sounds, of a language are the first to disappear and the hardest to revive, and that the basic vocabulary of a language is the last to disappear and the easiest to revive. And then the second is that language revitalization is important not only for language diversity and learning about what the human is capable of, but also for the well-being of its speakers. For my future research, there's a couple possible avenues I would take in learning more about language revitalization. I would want to look more into the different techniques and programs linguists use in order to revive a language. I got a glimpse of it in my research of the Hebrew language, but I want to see exactly which programs elicited the greatest success and which did not. This could help in the revival efforts of other extinct languages in the future. I would also want to look and see what has the biggest impact on a language actually successfully revitalizing. I know that there are a lot of factors such as economic factors, political factors, motivation, and institutional support, but I want to know which has the biggest impact. If we know which has the biggest impact, we can then target our programs and techniques towards that specific factor in order to reach more success. And then finally, I would also want to look and see other different revival efforts going on in Arizona. I know that there are projects going on here, and I would definitely like to learn more about language extinction in my own state. I think it'd be interesting to see and apply what I've learned in this course to languages here. Here is my list of references, and thank you for watching my presentation.